and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Adam LaFacci, your moderator, and I'll be turning the floor over to Greg Stevens now to kick off our program.
Thanks very much, Adam, and I'm very excited to be here with you and my colleague and friend, Sherry Levinsky-Raskin, and to be joining all of you in the audience for today's program. That is the first of a three-part series on access and inclusion. Before we get started formally, I do want to acknowledge that this program is supported in part by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So we are very grateful to them for their support. And this program is a partnership of several organizations, including the Coalition to Advance Learning in Archives, Libraries, and Museums, which is a project of the IMLS. And we're very grateful to our colleagues at OCLC for helping this project come to fruition, and our colleagues at the Museum Access Consortium in New York City for all their terrific partnership. And of course, our long-time partnership with our colleagues at Learning Times. Thank you for producing this program. This program is also produced in partnership with the Education Committee and the Diversity Committee, two of AAM's 22 professional networks. And of course, we think of all of you who are convened in webinar watch and talk events across the country as our partners as well. We are really looking forward to you enjoying this webinar program and also the post-webinar discussion that we hope you'll be having in your groups. At this time, I'm going to turn my microphone and the stage over to Sherry Levinsky-Raskin, who's going to talk to us a little bit about her role in this project and how it all came to be. Sherry, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Greg, for introducing all this so far. And I wanted to say hello to everyone and welcome to this first webinar in the series, Stories of Inclusion, Inclusive Practices at Cultural Institutions. I'm speaking to you today from my office at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where I'm the Assistant Vice President for Education and Evaluation. So as a co-moderator today, I'm also wearing two other hats as Chair-elect for Professional Development for the Education Professional Network, EDCOM, and as a steering committee member with the Museum Access Consortium, MAC. And I'm really, truly delighted to co-moderate this series and thrilled that we're going to be hearing from so many exceptional professionals, experts, and practitioners over the course of the three webinars. The topics that we're addressing in these webinars resonate with me in particular as being core to my practice as a museum professional, and I'm sure to all of you. Being an audience advocate, taking action and being responsive to visitors' needs through our programming, our space design, and our infrastructure, and being informed of current dialogue and ideas within the field, best practices and methodology. As you can imagine, discussions about each of the webinar topics could go way beyond our webinar time, as these discussions should, but we are limited in time, so each of our presenters, special guests, and colleagues sharing case studies have been quite selective as to their focus for today's webinar, and I thank them all so much for their time and enthusiasm to share about their work, their research, and ideas. And of course, I just want to thank every one of you for your time and being a part of this very important dialogue that reflects so much about what's central to what we do as museum professionals, whether you're joining us today from your offices or at a local watch and talk with your colleagues. So back to you, Greg.
Great, thanks very much, Sherry. And as you and I know, you and I have been working on this project alongside Barbara Johnson-Stemler from the Intrepid for over a year now, really, working on a variety of projects, including this series, but also sessions at the 2015 annual conference, the upcoming annual meeting in Washington, D.C., and especially the most recent issue of Museum Magazine that you see on the screen right now that is focused on museums and accessibility. So we're very excited to be producing this program and presenting it for our colleagues and with some very fine colleagues. We'll be hearing today from a variety of colleagues from within the museum field and outside the museum field. And just to give you a quick overview of how the program will flow, we'll hear from our three lead presenters, Betty Siegel, Bessie Barth, and Valerie Fletcher. They'll help shape the conversation and frame the discussion that follows. We'll also hear from our case study presenters, Rebecca Bradley, Rebecca McInnes, Katya Pereslevska, and Christine Reach. They'll be sharing perspective from their own professional practice and some of their own personal experiences. And then I'm very glad to have on board two special guests, Francesca Rosenberg and Ed Van Gemert, who will be giving us a little more information about accessibility training programs in the museum field and in the library field. The tail end of our program will include a quick view of an accessibility training video from the Museum of Modern Art, and Francesca Rosenberg will be helping to inform that presentation. And then we'll round up our program by hearing from all of our colleagues and presenters in a group conversation. Our program, of course, is focused on the Americans with Disabilities Act and universal design. We'll be hearing a range of perspectives about where the disability rights movement has come from and where it is now and where it will be headed. And Sherry, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, but our real goals here are to help build awareness, action, and advocacy so that you are more informed about the issues, that you're better able to take action in your institutions, and better able to advocate on behalf of accessibility and inclusion in our cultural institutions. So with that overview out of the way, I'm going to turn the stage over to my colleague, Betty Siegel from the Kennedy Center, who's going to talk to us about trends in cultural access. Betty, thanks very much for being with us today.
Sure, it's a delight. So let me just get started right away by talking about some of the trends that we're starting to see both internationally and nationally in cultural access. Basically, I break them down into three different categories: regulatory trends, non-regulatory trends, and the future. I'm going to start with the regulatory trends and talk a little bit about laws. So almost every country at this point has some sort of anti-discrimination law against people with disabilities. Now, not every country, I might exaggerate a little bit, but you have your country-level laws. You have, within countries, you'll have region or state or city or county-based laws that all address non-discrimination against people with disabilities. And you shouldn't ignore those regulations or those laws because they can be quite critical. In addition, what we see also at the international level is the UN, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It was a very well-supported law. It has Article 30 in it, which is really fascinating because Article 30 addresses the rights of human beings to participate in cultural life. And I think this is a pretty unique article in this convention. In essence, the article says that people with disabilities have a right to take part on an equal basis with others in cultural life. And that's what we do as cultural institutions. And they enumerate specific places such as theaters, museums, cinemas, libraries, and the right to enjoy access to monuments and sites of national cultural importance. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a link that takes you to a list, if you're curious, about disability rights laws by country. So if your country is represented, it'll be on this list, and you can find out what laws are addressing non-discrimination, addressing discrimination in your country by going to this link. Now, in the U.S., which I'm a little bit biased because I'm located in the U.S., so I focus a little bit more on U.S. law and regulation, we have a whole history of civil rights laws that address disability in one way or another. And we start with our own civil rights law that was passed in 1964. In 1968, of course, we have the federal government passing a law that ensures that access to federal buildings is provided, at least physically. In 1973, we have the Rehabilitation Act, which addressed the programs that we do if we receive federal financial assistance. And then finally, in 1990, we get the Americans with Disabilities Act, which specifically addresses people with disabilities and provides them protection under federal law. Now, we didn't stop in 1990 because in 2008 we had an amendment to the law which addressed some issues around who is actually a protected member under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in 2010, really importantly, we had updates to the regulations that help us understand how we can comply with federal law. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a wonderful tip sheet put out by the National Endowment for the Arts that addresses the changes in those 2010 regulations as they apply to cultural venues. So I think regulatory trends are really important to keep an eye on. They can be the basis for addressing non-discrimination and are critical to getting the entire culture, not just cultural institutions, but your entire society engaged in ensuring that people with disabilities are full participants. The non-regulatory trends that we're starting to see are more interesting. There are trends in population. So we see over 1 billion people in the world live with a disability. We see what the most common, that most people have mild disabling conditions. That's an interesting trend to consider. We see in the U.S. that there are 56.7 million Americans. Almost 19% of our population has a disability. We also see some trends in terms of how society views disability, and I like the World Health Organization's redefinition of disability as being a person is more or less disabled based on their interaction with the physical environment, the communication environment, the information, social, and policy environments. This is an interesting trend because it's starting to really move us away from seeing the person with the disability as being what needs to be fixed, and instead we're looking at the social, political, entire physical environment that is the issue in creating disability. And the problem becomes less about the human being and more about what we can do as a society to improve access. This is a critical trend. We see changes in markets. Older adults in the United States, the baby boomers are really taken off, and by 2030, there are going to be more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 30. And interestingly enough, that upper age group controls a good deal of the wealth, at least in the United States, which means they have more disposable income to participate in cultural activities. One of the other trends that we're starting to see is a trend towards disability-specific programming, and let me explain exactly what I mean by that. What we've been doing for many, many years now in the cultural community is creating inclusive programming that anyone and everyone without disabilities can participate in. We are really focused on, and I still think this is the correct focus, on seamless, transparent provision of accessibility in such a way that a person with a disability can walk right into any cultural venue and participate fully without having to necessarily ask for or receive special services. On the other hand, what this was doing was it was also cutting some people with disabilities out. If you have a child on the autism spectrum, attending a museum during the day might very well be prohibitive. And so we see in museums the start of providing sensory-friendly days or early openings at the museums so that families with children on the autism spectrum or other sensory sensitivities have the opportunity to participate. So when we look at these disability-specific programs, I want us to think about the fact that our opportunity here is to provide choice. You can choose to attend the museum anytime, any day. We've made it accessible to you. But you can also choose to attend a sensory-friendly day or an early opening. Whatever works for you, your family, your child, or you as a person with a disability. And so this is an interesting trend to make sure that we are actually inclusive to everybody. Technology, of course, is changing quick and fast. We have the introduction of telepresence robots roaming around museums. I've got a lovely picture of the beam at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and numerous other technologies that are either going to make access to cultural arts better, or could. Technology is wonderful because it either enhances the experience for people with disabilities, or it could provide another layer or barrier to participation for people with disabilities. So we have to really watch the technologies that are going into cultural arenas. The final trend that I want to address really quickly is the future. Now, wonderfully, AAM has the Center for the Future of Museums, and they've identified 3 trends that we're going to start seeing in the future. And they're trends in engagement. People want to engage, they want to be interactive, and there are a number of ways to do that in person or online. You see a personalization of products and services, communications, and experiences happening. One of the best examples, and I'm not promoting Coca-Cola, but if you've seen the new Coca-Cola machines that allow you to actually craft your own soda, that's a form of personalization. There's like 160 options for sodas now in a Coke machine. And then you have handheld and mobile wearable technologies that are really starting to surge. On the right-hand side, you see a gentleman named Jason Barnes. He's a drummer. He lost his arm and wanted to continue drumming, and he worked with Georgia Tech to create a prosthetic drumming arm. And if you look really closely, you see that that prosthetic has been personalized, customized to him for the specific purpose of drumming. It doesn't have fingers. It has drumsticks at the end. So the future looks really interesting to me from this perspective, and the trends, I think, are towards more inclusive programming for people with disabilities, more choice, and more opportunity. And we've got information here about AAM's Trends Watch, which I think are really stellar resources. So I'm going to give the microphone back to Greg.
Thanks very much, Betty, and I'm glad that you ended your presentation with a quick nod to the Trends Watch reports that come out of AAM's Center for the Future of Museums. As you indicated, a number of these trends are related to technology, of course, but also to broader issues of accessibility. So thank you very much for that quick overview. And Betty, thank you for providing your contact information, and any of you in the audience who'd like to connect with Betty, I know that she'd be very happy to hear from you. We're going to turn our attention now to our colleague, Beth Zebarth, who's going to talk about museum accessibility, a little bit of a look back and a look at where we are now. Beth, thank you for being here today from the Smithsonian Institution Accessibility Program.
Thank you, Greg, and I'm really pleased to be here with all of the presenters and other speakers, and really welcome the people who are out there listening to the webinar. Thank you for being here. So I will use good technique in terms of accessibility, and I will describe my my photos that I have on my slides. This is a photo of the Smithsonian's red brick castle building, taken from the Hauptgarten. The castle is the original Smithsonian Museum building. Betty talked about the civil rights laws that form the basis for accessibility in the United States. And one of the things that I want to touch on is the sort of the history of how we got to the laws like the Rehab Act and the ADA. And when you think back to World War II and the veterans who were coming back from war who had disabilities, they were seeking equal participation in society. They were asking for legal protection in terms of employment, being able to continue school and participate in society. This photo from the Lowndes Interpretive Center exhibit is one where we have 5 mannequins appear to stride out from a large black and white photo of a civil rights march. One male mannequin carries an American flag, another male mannequin is on crutches, and 3 women mannequins include a young woman, an older woman in a suit, and a nun in full habit. So I imagine that the young man with the crutches might even be a World War II veteran. One of the things that's really important in the disability community is to communicate the idea that disability rights are civil rights. That just like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, like Betty was talking about, all of the laws that pertain to people with disabilities are civil rights laws. And this is a photo from an ADAPT action. ADAPT is a pan-disability, politically outspoken and active disability rights organization founded in 1978. In the photo, dozens of ADAPT members at this protest action have hung a wheelchair on a cross and carry signs and an American flag with a wheelchair outlined in stars. This is a photo from Tom Olin. And one of the important parts about the civil rights in the disability community is that we're trying to get rid of outdated stereotypes about disability. We're looking for full inclusion in society, and just like those World War II veterans, we are still working on getting a job, being able to shop in our neighborhood, and go to our local museums. Some of the things that museums were doing even before the laws had come into effect. There's some good examples of how museums were acknowledging and addressing the needs of people with disabilities. So this particular slide is from What If You Couldn't, an exhibition in 1976 from the Boston Children's Museum. And in this black and white photo, 2 children in blindfolds, one with a white cane, make their way through a passageway in the exhibit. So an early example of an exhibition dealing with disability content. Also, in the 80s, my colleague and mentor, Jan Majewski, wrote Part of Your General Public is Disabled in 1987, a Smithsonian publication, which was a guide to help docents better address the needs of people with disabilities who were in their tour group. So there was a book and a video that were put together for docent training. We also had, in the 70s and 80s, the NEA was publishing material on being 504 compliant from the Rehab Act, and they were doing training in addition to the resource materials and appointing 504 coordinators across the arts agencies that were receiving federal funds. So that was an important step towards accessibility in many museums. With the passage of the ADA in 1990, many museums were much more aware of their legal responsibilities. And not surprisingly, a lot of them focused initially on facility access. And I think that's partly because of the standards that go along with the federal laws, which very clearly articulate, the built environment standards. So museums were looking at the how somebody approached the museum, whether from a parking lot or from a bus stop. They were looking at their doors, whether there was a ramp necessary, and once somebody got inside the building, bathroom access or access to the public program spaces or the museum shop. And as we progressed in our thinking about accessibility in museums, we started looking more at programs. And I think that one of the things that helped us think more about effective communication and what that means is some of the settlement agreements that the Department of Justice had with a variety of museums. So the International Spy Museum, the Newseum, Mount Vernon, and some of those settlement agreements really helped us in the museum field understand better what the Department of Justice meant by effective communication. So on this particular slide for the Revealing Culture exhibition, I have an example of a tactile object along with audio description. So this is a red beaded tube dress that's on display, and next to it is a touchable example of the beading on an adjacent shelf, and with a sign that says, "Please touch." I think that one of the areas that museums have really moved into working on accessibility is cognitive access. And so we have two examples here of really great programs that have been developed in New York. There's New York Transit Museum Subway Sleuth. And we have a photo of three little boys who are engaged in a conversation inside a subway train. And an example from the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where the programming at the museum allows individuals with dementia and their caregivers to look at historic photographs and objects together while listening to and sharing stories. So moving a little more into the future, this is something that, this is a visitor typology that a friend of mine has developed called IPOP, and it's a theory of experience preference. It's developed by Andrew Pekarik and James Schreiber and a couple of other folks, and based on lots of interviews with museum visitors over the years, and developing a framework for understanding experience preference. And they broke it down into ideas, people, objects, and physical. And so ideas are an attraction to concepts, abstractions, facts and reasons. People, an attraction to human connection. Objects, an attraction to the things or aesthetics. And physical, any kind of movement, touch, sound, taste, light, smell. And all of these things go into what a visitor prefers. And what kind of, for me, there was a light bulb moment where I realized that people with disabilities have exactly the same visitor preferences, and yet a lot of our techniques are not necessarily addressing those visitor preferences. We're much more object focused. And so my challenge to all of us is to start thinking about how we engage the whole person more. This final slide is a picture of the Cool Aspies, a local group of young adults who have formed a social activities club. They're at Curious at the Natural History Museum, where they are using Smithsonian research, objects, data, etc., to talk about different scientific concepts. And it's a good example of engaging the whole person. One of the things that that Greg wanted me to mention is that in your progression into inclusion of people with disabilities, think about your regional access cultural consortia. So there are a lot of them now across the country, everything from Access Indy Artability in Arizona, Bay Area Access Collective, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, the Cultural Access New England, the DC Arts and Access Network, Museum Access Consortium in New York we mentioned before. There's one in Florida, one in Pittsburgh, one in New Jersey, and also LEAD, the Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disabilities through the Kennedy Center, does an annual conference and has a network of people working in accessibility, and of course AAM's annual meeting. So there are many ways for us to, as professionals in accessibility, to think about inclusion. So I will stop there and turn it over to Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you, Greg. As representing AAM, Greg and Sherry, AAM has really outdone itself the last couple of years in being really seriously committed on this. And I think the effort to not only look at where we've been, but where do we need to go? And we couldn't do better than that kind of commitment from AAM. So hats off to you folks. I am picking up from my colleagues, and though they have both referenced it, I'm going to be picking up more on inclusive and universal design. And I am actually sort of trending personally towards the preference for inclusive design. You may know that there are different terms used around the world, and universal design sometimes just doesn't resonate enough in terms of its relationship to human experience and human diversity. Our colleagues in the UK have long adopted inclusive, and I'm using that much more. Two starting beliefs as we think about why design matters and why inclusive design matters. Design matters because it will matter whether you do it right or wrong. The interaction with the environment is going to be a determinant of experience, not only about how we experience the world, but how we feel about ourselves. And the second point that is absolutely more true every day is that variation in ability is so ordinary. We are past special. This is not about them over there, never has been, but it surely isn't today. And that image on this slide is actually an image of our headquarters in Boston, in which we are trumpeting inspiring words about inclusive design on our windows, which go on for over 100 feet in 7 languages. I do want to call out, as Betty and Beth have done, that we are blessed and privileged in the United States to have accessibility laws and codes that recognize that design is a civil and human right. The equity between civil and human right has been brought up, but I think the fact that the United States owned the idea of design as a civil right really is a defining quality of our understanding about civil rights for people with disabilities. And I think we should make sure that we carry that forward. Two ideas that have been referenced, and two ideas I just want to identify in a particular way. They're from 504, so they date back to 73, reinforced for everyone with the ADA, that they are really important bridges to universal or inclusive design. And that's effective communication and integrated setting. And part of why they are so important, they were big ideas from the get-go, but I think part of the reality is that they are concepts of inclusion that are constantly evolving. Thinking about effective communication, my God, what we knew about communication 25 years ago is nowhere near where we are today. And that notion of integrated setting, how relevant that is to engaging the whole person. That notion that you don't have to raise your hand as a person. I am a person with a disability. I'm wearing the beanie. Rather, this is about making the world work for everyone and be welcoming. The catalyst for a changed attention to thinking about the role of design is really the reality of our times, the fortunate times that we are lucky enough to live in. I'm showing an image here that is from partly the UN and partly a group in the UK. It's really people 60 and over across the world between 1950 and 2050, a 100-year span, and that goes only in one direction, of course, up in terms of the proportion of the population over 60. But what is significant about this image versus many that you see is that it draws out that this is both a developed world and a developing world story. So the turquoise parts of these bars are the developing world, where, of course, most of the world lives. And this story applies across the board. This isn't about those of us lucky to live in an affluent country. The other catalyst that is terribly significant, partly related to the fact that we live 30 years on average longer than we did 100 years ago, is the experience of a functional limitation or disability. And Betty referenced that earlier. I'm going to speak about that again in a minute. But that notion of its ordinariness. This image depicts 7 little stick figures of humans, 6 around one in the middle. The one in the middle represents 1 in 7 people on the planet have a disability. And that is 1 billion people on the planet. And I'd like to just note here that one of the things that we give short shrift to sometimes is that looking at population data and demographics from around the world, we still have enormous chunks of the world that do not count mental reasons for functional limitation. And I think if you do, this is a serious undercount. I'm bringing in two people who represent an enormous contribution to how we have made our way from thinking about doing the right thing for people with disabilities to thinking about a world that welcomes everyone. Both of them were architects. Both of them had polio. And they both had a credibility that probably wouldn't have been available if they didn't have the lived experience of disability themselves. One was Ron Mace in the United States. He stressed just less than 2 weeks before he died, stressed that we need to be very clear about the difference between accessibility and universal design. That accessibility focuses on people with disabilities, but it is only a floor for thinking about designing for people. Universal design anticipates human diversity at the general level, really thinking about everyone. And Selwyn Goldsmith, doing this work at the same time as Ron, this particular focus was in 2000. He too was an author and frequent speaker. He too critiqued accessibility as top-down provisions for people with disabilities, a necessary starting point. But he argued for a shift to a bottom-up way of thinking that reframes normal to anticipating diversity of ability. If we live a typical lifespan today, normal will include some level of functional limitation. I have the usual definition of universal design, inclusive design, design for all, here, and that nomenclature is something that I think people can make their decision about what they're comfortable with. Design for all, hyphenated, is the European Union's typical choice, but it's really a framework for thinking differently about everything. Places things, information, communication, and policy, focusing on the user, on the widest range of people, operating in the widest range of situations, without special or separate design. We use the term human-centered design, partly because of its straightforward quality, but human-centered design of everything with everyone in mind. The principles of universal design, most likely this is an audience that knows these principles well. There are a variety of variations on this across the world, but they are commonplace principles of good design: equitable, flexible, intuitive, perceptible, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use. And I think the interpretation of these varies based on the circumstance, the context that we're designing. Betty has already referenced the importance of global policies and brought up the Convention on the Human Rights of People with Disabilities, which I think is an invaluable way to carry this conversation in a meaningful way as global dialogue. Just in the last week, I have had the great privilege of working with people in a couple of parts of the world that were early devotees of the CRPD, but still struggling 9 years later to build any capacity for implementing the CRPD. So I think for those of us in America, in the United States, we have a particular opportunity to be generous in the global sphere. And I'm really just speaking here to the same point that Betty made very early on. that functional limitation is a universal human experience. This is about all of us. This is about the human condition. Critical point about the World Health Organization in the definition of disability in 2001, equalizing mental and physical reasons for limitations. That was earth-shattering for the World Health Organization to take on, because it was a very tough sell in parts of the world that are still not there. But very important for us as we move forward on inclusive culture. They define disability as a contextual variable. Functional limitation is what has become so prevalent. It becomes disabling based on the intersection of the individual and the environment. And as Betty has said, physical, communication, information, policy, social, and attitudinal, none of us could get through our day if we were only concerned with the context of our lives that was physical. It's important to note also that just 4 years after the principles of universal design were first promulgated and published, the UN, through the World Health Organization, was already touting this as the most promising framework. And I think it's important to borrow the language of the World Health Organization that was basically making a point that barrier removal or accessibility was no longer adequate for a world in which we lived so long and survived so much, that we needed to identify facilitators for performance, for experience, and to minimize the functional limitations that so many of us will experience over the course of time. And I want to close with a reminder that this vision of inclusion is about supporting the common shared goals of the cultural sector. Here I'm taking from the wonderful Wallace Foundation 2012 report, Building Arts Organizations that Build Audiences. And of course, this is so relevant to our conversation today and on the future webcasts in this series. Broadening audiences by attracting more people with the same profiles as the ones you already have. Deepening audiences by enriching the experience of your current audience so that they want more. And God knows we all seem to want more. That notion of engaging the whole person is becoming something that none of us are happy if we are not experiencing that. And then diversifying audiences by attracting and keeping new people with a different profile from your usual audience. And I think as we think about that, part of our challenge will be to also engage people who don't think about themselves as people with disabilities, but that are experiencing the kinds of functional limitations typical to late life for many of us, changes in sensory ability, changes in physical ability, changes in our cognitive abilities, and recognizing that we need to lay out a welcome mat in the whole experience that doesn't require that people pre-identify as having some kind of functional limitation. And I'll close with, what do we do now? And I think this is what AAM deserves a round of applause for. We need to catalyze a community of cultural learners and innovators who believe that life in all its variety is our collective good fortune, and it's a vehicle for richer experiences for everyone. And this last image is one of a soundscape by the wonderful artist Nick Cave, in which everyone is dancing together. Thanks very much, and I will now pass it back to Greg.
Valerie, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. And as Sherry and Barbara and I, in planning this program, identified, our goal here is to build awareness and action and advocacy, but also to share information and inspiration, and certainly do that, as do you, Beth and Betty. As you were all talking, I was reflecting on a couple of things. One is, Beth, I know in our earlier conversations you have really focused on the notion of the whole person, and I'm thinking about a part of one of the articles in the current issue of Museum Magazine, an article by Day Al-Mohammed, who talked about Helen Keller as being most known as the deafblind advocate for people with disabilities, but she was also a radical progressive, a suffragist, a socialist, an advocate for fair pay, a supporter of communism, a pacifist in a time of war, pro-civil rights, anti-child labor, a whole range of other aspects to her as an individual. And so when I hear you talk about the whole individual, I think about that. And I think that's a pretty compelling message. And the other thing that's very interesting to me, and you were describing the disability rights movement, it was interesting for me to find out that the movement was not always a unified movement. It wasn't a whole group of like-minded people who all agreed on the same points or the same strategies. And I wonder if Valerie, Beth, or Betty, if any of you have any commentary on that, sort of creating a whole movement out of disparate parts.
This is Betty. I'll leap in with a small little piece of history, which is that one of the movements that really consolidated the disability community, really pulled them together, was, in the United States at least, was this effort to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. I think that the community recognized that without a unified front going forward to get legislation of this dimension and depth into law was going to really require them to set aside differences and coalesce with one message when they approached Congress. And thank goodness that they did that, because that was one of the ways in which we achieved our civil rights law for people with disabilities.
And this is Valerie. I'm just going to jump in for 1 minute. At that point in my career, I was running a large advocacy organization for people with psychiatric disabilities, and the fight was intense, whether people with psychiatric disabilities would be part of the family in moving forward on the ADA, and it was often stressful and not always pleasant. And it was an enormous boon that people with psychiatric disabilities were part of the ADA. And I think now that seems like such a dim memory. I'm sure there are many young people on the call who couldn't imagine that could have, happened in 88, 89, 90, but it was part of the campaign. And when it coalesced, it was magical, and it made people feel a sense of partnership that was utterly different and new.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to do a quick reminder to everybody in the audience. If you do have any questions or comments for us, please feel free to type them into the chat box. And Laura, Edith, thank you very much for sharing a great resource. But we also encourage you in the audience to share any resources you might have, whether it's a program or an initiative at your institution, or an online resource, or some other kind of information you'd like to share. Please feel free to do so. With that said, I'm going to move right along into our next section of our program on case studies. And our first case study is going to be focusing on the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And I'm very happy to have Rebecca Bradley, who is the manager of access programs at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, here to talk to us about some of the interesting changes that are happening in your organization. Rebecca, welcome.
Thanks, Greg, and hi, listeners. Let me just advance to the first slide. So, as Greg said, I'm the manager of access programs at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and my brief presentation today is based on an article I co-wrote with the same title that is on screen now. So, Inclusive Museum Experiences, a team approach, and this article will then be published in The Exhibitionist later this fall, so keep an eye out for it. So just a brief visual description of the slide before jumping in. There is an image of the DeYoung Museum, which is the upper left-hand corner, Copper Building, and then moving clockwise, a seal of the city and county of San Francisco. An image of the Legion of Honor in the lower right-hand corner, and then the museum logo is in the lower left-hand corner. So the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco include both the DeYoung Museum and the Legion of Honor. The Fine Arts Museums are the largest public arts institution in the city of San Francisco. We are ranked 5th in attendance among art museums in the United States, with approximately 1.5 to 1.75 million visitors per year. So FAMSF is a City and County of San Francisco department, along with 2 other museums in San Francisco, the California Academy of Sciences and the Asian Art Museum. So because we are a city department, the museums are a Title II, Title III hybrid under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So moving on, the next slide is titled City ADA Coordinator, and it is text only. There is a small logo in the lower left-hand corner for the museum. So all city departments are required to have an ADA coordinator who handles ADA compliance with federal and state disability rights laws. Therefore, there's this built-in support network if necessary. I work closely with the ADA coordinator at the California Academy of Sciences because we're in close proximity to each other, being across the park, but also because it's important to have that sense of support from your colleagues. So ADA coordinators also receive training from the mayor's office on disability and then are expected to provide staff training at their home departments. And so I also handle complaints filed through the mayor's office on disability about museum services or programs. So I wear 2 hats, being physical and programmatic access manager. But I also work closely implementing the language access ordinance at the museums. And this was enacted in 2001 to provide equal access to city services to all San Franciscans, including those with limited proficiency in English. So right now we are in the process of implementing this ordinance and making sure that our materials are in various languages as well as ASL at all times. So moving forward, this next slide, I'll describe it and then talk a little bit about collaboration. So museum staff are walking through an archway, accompanying a white car painted by Keith Haring. The car is in the center of the photograph. There's 1 staff member sitting in the driver's seat steering the car, 1 staff member on our left-hand side guiding the car, 2 staff members on our right-hand side guiding the car, and several staff members behind the car ensuring its safety. And it is being guided through a rectangular archway. And then at the bottom of the screen, the word collaboration is written in black text. So collaboration is something really important when we discuss access at the museums. It takes effort, particularly in institutions that have traditionally worked in silos. It is no easy feat. At every opportunity here, Access Programs works to reinforce the point that all staff is responsible for creating an accessible visitor experience, and it's not the job of a single person or department. And there is ongoing conversation, open conversation, and dialogue all the time. But how do we effectively collaborate on exhibitions here? So describing the slide once again before I start chatting, it is a white background with black text, and at the lower left corner of the slide there are some text questions, but there is an image on the upper left corner of an exhibition plan hung on a wall, 2-dimensional, and then the lower right-hand corner there is an image of a 3-dimensional exhibition model. So Access Programs' role in exhibition planning has progressed from an informal role to a formalized role in which staff is now involved throughout the process. This allows potential accessibility issues to be identified and addressed early on and helps educate the staff about access needs. So Access staff looks for potential red flags during exhibition planning, including but certainly not limited to use of in-gallery technology, unique display of objects, label placement depending on the nature of the exhibition, use of videos in the exhibition that would call for captioning, the contrast between the floor and platforms depending on what color exhibition designers have chosen. And then of course light levels is something that's really important. So when reviewing the exhibition floor plans, we also look for dimensions of the platforms in the cases, the shape of the platform, especially if there are any hard or sharp edges that someone may walk into, or if there are any trip and fall hazards. The placement of platforms and object cases, dimensions of doorways, and the floor space between walls and platforms. Path of travel, emergency exit pathways, visitor flow, and of course, I feel like everyone's favorite, the placement of benches. So it's a true collaborative effort in terms of exhibition design here, and it is also a holistic approach. And as I just discussed, it's very centered on collaboration, but it's not something that just happened overnight. And we've had programs at the museum since the 1970s, and what started as an informal relationship with exhibitions, planning these upcoming shows, has turned into a more formal role. And it does take into account that my job is both physical and programmatic access, that I work closely with most, if not all, departments, and that we work to create an open and ongoing dialogue among staff members and across departments. So the next slide, there are two women sitting in wheelchairs having a conversation amongst a crowd, and at the bottom, customer service. The words customer service are written. And we foster a view of access as a customer service instead of the law. So when contacted with an access question, staff's encouraged to consider the visitor experience rather than the museum's legal obligation. And with this mindset, several aha moments have taken place. So frontline staff are provided training to ensure all visitors, regardless of age or ability, have a positive experience at the museum. And we've experimented with a few various training models, and the most recent training model included smaller groups, so open conversations about experiences with access, accessible design, and problem solving could take place. And then scheduling these small group sessions versus scheduling sessions for large numbers of staff is easier, and it allows staff to share questions, concerns, and information in an informal setting. So what we have learned through the process of collaboration and a holistic approach is that access benefits everyone. So here, that is really what we focus and emphasize on as a staff. And with that, I will turn it back over to Greg, or turn it over to Rebecca McGinnis, one or the other.
Actually, thanks very much, Rebecca, and I appreciate you giving us a perspective of the holistic, intentional approach you're taking at your institution to addressing access and inclusion. And we'll go right into Rebecca McGinnis's program, a case study from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Rebecca, thank you for sharing your experience with us today.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about one case study that illustrates just one possible model of inclusive practice. And the Met has a long history of working towards accessibility and inclusion. And so in this one example, I'm going to try and collapse a 15-year process, basically. So as Rebecca Bradley said, all of this doesn't happen overnight, and I think we're all constantly evolving in our practice and in our perspective. So this case study is one of focusing on inclusion in a programmatic context, focusing on the deaf community, the ASL community. And in this model, this group is identified as a cultural and linguistic minority. Deaf people often do not consider themselves to be people with disabilities, but they are, by having another language, disabled by the communication environment, certainly, as Valerie explained to us so eloquently. And in this model, we're not thinking of a deficit. It's not a deficit model. The focus is not on people who can't hear, but rather a partnership model. And here we have a slide. This is one of our deaf educators, our ASL educators, Deborah Cole, in front of an abstract expressionist painting, giving a tour in sign language to a group. So the goal here is really to move beyond accessibility to inclusion in a variety of aspects of the life of the museum. But I think it's worth noting here that in this case, the community desires programming in ASL, so specifically for the deaf community, which may at first seem counter to the principles of universal design or inclusion. But as you'll see as things unfold here, I think there are many approaches to inclusion, many ways of thinking about inclusion. And this model is really about partnership, not service provision, and inclusion through partnership. Here's another image of another, actually, former ASL guide who's unfortunately no longer in the city, Guthrie Nutter, who's giving a tour in front of a Van Gogh painting to a group of deaf camp kids in summer camp. So, as I mentioned, we have a long history of programming and accessibility at the Metropolitan Museum. In the 1980s, there were a number of deaf volunteer guides. There was a very rich program of interpreted tours, but around the turn of the century, around 2000, we decided we needed a refresh, a new way to connect with and engage the deaf community, and we wanted to involve more deaf people in the creation of programs. So in 2001, we started a program called An Evening of Art in ASL, which was a tour followed by a reception, and we really wanted to create a welcoming space, a social time in the museum, and an opportunity for us to find out what people wanted, to find out what our audience wanted to do, how they wanted to participate in the museum. So some people wanted to give tours, so we established a training program called Met Signs, and trained a number of deaf people who became educators at the museum. And then that process continued from about, let's see, the first training program was in 2003, and over the next 10 years and really continuing, our deaf educators participate in the evolution of our ASL program, Met Signs, to include choice, just as we've been hearing, to offer different ways of engaging with the connection, with the collection, whether it's through art making, through tours, through online experiences, whether you're a kid, an adult, part of a group, an individual. Here we have Emmanuel von Schack, who's one of our educators giving a tour in ASL, another example of that. And the guides have really been very much partners in outreach to the deaf community. Their communication through social networks, as well as kind of more formal advertising, has been essential in involving other members of the deaf community in different aspects of programming. And this is an image of a group participating in a reception. The guides also give tours in just regular drop-in, scheduled gallery talks for any audience, and there's a voice interpreter translating into English for non-ASL users. And I think this really makes everybody, the hearing audience, the deaf community, the staff in the museum, think, who is the expert here? Who is representing the museum? Who's receiving the accommodation, in fact, in this case? And this is a way of including and validating diverse perspectives, and really challenging assumptions about the role and the authority of deaf people in the museum environment. So I wanted to just quickly show you part of a video. I'm just going to skip to a different, let's slide came out funny. I wanted to show you a video in just a moment, a part of one, about a particular sculpture in the collection. This is an example from a cross-departmental digital project on body language and sculpture called Viewpoints. That really gave us an opportunity to further position our deaf educators, or one of our deaf educators, as the expert. And here, not as an art historian, but as a user of a visual gestural language. So let's see if we can pull up a bit.
Immediately noticeable in this piece is that Ugolino's hands are at his face and he's biting his fingers. From this, I instantly recognize his tremendous suffering. Hands and facial expressions are critical components of communication in American Sign Language, or ASL. Other features of ASL include body language, movement in 3D space, pacing, among others. But primary among them are facial expressions and hand shapes. My eye follows his form down to his feet, and I recognize the approach to their oversized representation is similar to his enormous hands.
There are 5 videos in this series of different perspectives from experts in different disciplines. They're dancers, artists, neuroscientists, and the intention is to offer these different perspectives and different modalities to enrich the user's experience of the sculptures in this project, and to encourage new ways of thinking. Having this example in ASL is just an example of one of these different modalities and perspectives. So these are a couple of examples of small steps in supporting the museum in its larger role as an agent of social change. And so just to kind of recap a bit, accessibility is certainly a necessary precursor and a foundation to inclusion. And this partnership model is, I think it has been a very effective way for us to involve, to include diverse perspectives and really offer a deeper, richer, broader, mutually beneficial way of including different audiences in the life of the museum. So I'll hand back to Greg now.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And we're going to zip right along into our next case study on inclusive libraries from Katya Karaslavska. Katya, thanks a lot for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. I am the Accessibility Librarian at Scholars Portal at the Ontario Council of University Libraries, which is a consortium of 21 university libraries in Ontario, in Canada. And this year, I also took on a secondment at the Association of Research Libraries as a visiting program officer, working with Accessibility and Universal Design Working Group, where I was tasked to work towards raising awareness of inclusive publishing throughout conferences, publications, webinars, and surveys. So that's just a little bit about my role. I am also on Twitter. Sorry, the following slide has a little selfie of me, so you can have a sense of the visual, as well as if you are on Twitter, please do follow my tweets and to find out what's going on with libraries across North America and Ontario specifically. I'm the social librarian. So what I wanted to do was briefly look at the legal frameworks, obligations, and opportunities for libraries, and collaborative projects. So in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, and it's a federal legislation. Whereas in Canada, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, known as the AODA, is a provincial legislation. It's gaining rapid momentum with other provinces like Manitoba and Nova Scotia. We're also developing similar legislative pieces, but we don't have a federal legislation at this point yet. So The AODA has a series of standards with rolling obligations, and we have various deadlines that started on January 1st, 2012, and will continue annually until January 1st, 2025. The big difference between the AODA and the ADA is that AODA is quite prescriptive. It's not reactive. So it's very proactive. So we have to we have specific measures and requirements, and we have to prepare. So both of these frameworks in the United States and Canada provide many organizations with pretty big challenges insofar as how to interpret what at times can appear to be fairly vague legalese and how to make sense of these requirements on the institutional level. I think a bigger question yet is how not to limit our organizations by the legislation and to find opportunities to go beyond the minimum compliance through innovative solutions. So the obligations and opportunities for libraries, I was thinking that the ADA and the AODA present a fairly unique set of opportunities for research libraries in the following areas. We have opportunities to collaborate to build an effective community of practice. We have that advocacy piece where we can take on a role to raise awareness and instigate institutional change, as well as to effectively reach relevant stakeholders. And there's a leadership opportunity as well to define legislative intent with broader inclusivity and mandate in mind. We can test our copyright boundaries and look for unique opportunities tailored to institutional context. So on the collaborative projects front, I think that given that neither the Canadian nor the American government offer ongoing funding to support our organizations in ensuring compliance with these legislations, collaborative solutions have many benefits, such as cost saving in staff and resources, enabling the exchange of expertise, and helping to ensure consistency in the interpretation of the law across different organizations. This sense-making, where it comes to understanding what the legislation requires our organizations to do, is easily one of the most challenging areas for libraries, as we offer a wide breadth of services and resources. So I wanted to present a number of case studies, and the following will be a series of anonymized case scenarios, essentially, which I drew from real-life examples encountered in research library settings. Case number 1 revolves around the library space for faculty event, where a graduate student requested a transcript and a video of a talk 2 days before it was scheduled to take place. So library staff were unsure how to proceed with regard to securing services transcription services that would offer this support. Where to start? Do they need to talk to faculty? Do they need to, who do they need to reach out on campus? This was a university. Services could be hired, but who would absorb that cost? And this is kind of going back again to legislative requirements, but like a funding from the government to cover some of these costs. I think the opportunity in this case was to identify a unique role that library played within its organizational context. And identifying that role early on before you have a case that comes up is really critical. Speaking with administration, looking for funding revenues, and looking at possible scenarios. What if this scenario came up, what would we do? I have a case study number 2, and this deals with publisher content. And it's something that's a recurring scenario for libraries. Publisher content often comes with digital locks, preventing a user access to the file with the use of assistive technology. So this situation happened very recently where a license with the publisher included an accessibility clause, but when one librarian made a request for an accessible copy of an accessible PDF of a book, they were advised by the publisher that a student needed to purchase this material. And this was despite the fact that the library had already paid for for this material in digital format. Digitally born content continues to pose a significant barrier to accommodating library users, and publishers lack the necessary awareness and possibly funding to change their practices and work with libraries to make this process easier. So libraries really do need to take on a proactive advocacy role to promote inclusive learning materials and educate publishers about why this is important to us. And I guess organizations need to start thinking about procuring accessibly wherever possible, as opposed to dealing with situations that come up as a result of inaccessible content. My last case study, this scenario looks, it did take place at a large Ontario Diversity Library, and it looks at a scholar who is visiting the library for a short period of time, who self-declared as having a disability and requested library materials to be provided in accessible format. Because they were not a current student or faculty at the university, there was very little way of verifying their disability claim. But the library staff did their best, and they looked for creative solutions in accommodating this individual. So this is a scenario that is going to continue causing issues for libraries as we struggle to provide inclusive services within our copyright limit. I think some community colleges in Ontario have rolled out a self-declaration form for all library users, and perhaps that's something that a lot more organizations can consider in the future. There are a number of other slides which I don't have time to go through. There are a number of tools and resources, but perhaps those of you who are attending might receive a complimentary copy of the presentation, so you're more than welcome to review these on your own time.
Great, thank you very much, Katya. And I'm going to turn the microphone and the stage over to my colleague, Christine Reach from the Museum of Science, Boston. Christine, thank you so much.
Hello, it's so wonderful being here. I've enjoyed everyone's presentation so far. I'm going to talk about work we're doing at the Museum of Science, where we're really pushing for inclusion through organizational learning. And as I talk about the work at the Museum of Science, I'm also bringing to this discussion some studies I've done in the past of looking at organizational change toward the inclusion of people with disabilities at other museums, as well as theories of change from both the education sector and the business sector. But I'm using the Museum of Science to really frame some of those ideas that are coming from a broader literature sense. So I want to think one of the most important things I can share with you is at the Museum of Science, we have a vision for accessibility that was created by our Accessibility Committee, which includes senior leadership from the museum, and was improved by our senior management team. And our statement is very simple, and we say that the Museum of Science Boston is committed to the inclusion of people with disabilities and will, and that's a really important word, create an environment that is inviting, engaging, and accessible for everyone. That will was a really purposeful word that we put into that definition because we wanted to state that we don't see ourselves as getting to an end state where we'll say, okay, we've done inclusion enough, we've thought about accessibility enough. We really wanted to have something where we're continually striving to really invite in everyone. And that really shapes how we think about access as an organization. Our overall approach, kind of married to that, is this idea of continuous improvement and change through organizational learning. Even though we have buy-in throughout the senior management team, we're not thinking of this as a top-down directive, but rather we're trying to get the whole organization to change by learning through their practice, by continually experimenting and seeing how far we can push our definition of inclusion. What I'm showing here on the slide is a picture of the Museum of Science in the 1960s, where there's a beautiful black and white photo of a little girl sitting next to a diorama with her hands folded on her lap, and we all know that's exactly how children behave in science museums. We've moved away from that kind of ideal of a museum visitor to the picture that you would see on the right, which is of a playground that's inside our museum where we teach about Newtonian physics. That's multi-sensory, hands-on, whole body and tabletop, audio description as well as text and images, all different kinds of ways to support learning for our museum visitors. We have a number of strategies that we use to really push for this organizational learning. So the number one strategy is really this involvement of people with disabilities in our work. This gets to that question that Stephanie Rosen and the folks at the University of Michigan raised earlier in the chat box about the idea of nothing about us without us. We have staff members with disabilities who are involved in all aspects of our operation. We have volunteers, interns. We also have paid advisors, paid consultants. And then sometimes we invite in people with disabilities to serve as co-developers and co-designers through Design Charrettes. The picture here, you'll see amongst the four professionals is a man with a white cane who's a computer scientist who's helping us to design a new computer interface during a Design Charrette. The importance of involving people with disabilities in our work is not just giving them a voice, that they're helping us to define the problems that will work for them. But I think also, more importantly, it personalizes the issue for staff. They stop thinking of people with disabilities as an abstract audience, but rather think about people with disabilities as their friends, colleagues, coworkers. So we're doing it for everyone. Another important part of our organizational learning strategy is the idea of embedding inclusive practices in our work and in our existing communication. What I found is when the other museums that I've studied, when they think about it as a specialized practice, it's something that will exist for a short period of time, but is very unlikely to be sustained. But when you embed inclusive practices in your everyday work and your everyday communication, it's more likely to be sustained by the organization. So at the Museum of Science, right at our information desk, we have a list of our guest services. And that list includes the availability of strollers as well as wheelchairs, the availability of assisted listening devices, as well as foreign language interpretation. What's also important about that communication is it's right there as all of our staff are entering in, so they're familiar with those services. Also, for any major initiative, we also make sure that our museum is more accessible at the conclusion of that initiative. And we also embed inclusive ideology around universal design for learning in our stage presentations at the Museum of Science. So our everyday stage presentations that all of our visitors go to have descriptive language embedded within it, the use of screens to deliver information through text, as well as the traditional auditory description of our educators, as well as tactile models. So we're trying to do it every day in all the work we do. Another critical part of our learning is engaging in ongoing experimentation and reflection about inclusive practices. So the slide here, what I'm showing is an image actually of a label we're testing out this very week. We're trying to think about how we move away from just using text to using a lot more imagery to convey our instructional information at our interactive. Whether or not this label will work, we're not sure yet. We're, again, testing it out this week. But the idea is to use more imagery that works well for people with learning disabilities, people who are deaf and have American Sign Language as their primary language, who tend to be more visual learners, as well as for early learners and people for whom English may not be their first language. So really thinking about experimenting even down to our label copy every week. We also have a bigger experiment going on where we're looking at engagement and how museums tend to define engagement and the emotional reactions that trigger engagement. And some of the work at CAST is suggesting that engagement and the emotional reactions might be very different from different learners. CAST is the originators of the concept of universal design for learning, and we're partnering with them. That's a much broader experiment that we have going on at the same time that we're doing smaller scale experiments with our label copy. And then finally, one of the key parts as part of our organizational learning is continually to promote inclusive practices as something that benefits people with and without disabilities. So this idea of better for everyone is something that earlier presenters have talked about. We actually have a number of research studies here at the Museum of Science that show that this can actually be true. We have a number of situations where we've created experiences for people with disabilities that have benefited people without disabilities. So on the screen, you could see a computer interactive where two participants sit across from each other. Each has a touch screen, and they come across content related to social issues that connect to science. And what we found is that when we redesigned our touchscreen to be a gestural interface that was more inclusive for people who are blind as well as for people with limited reach, that all of our visitors were actually intending more deeply to the content. This is the latest kind of study that we've done, where we've done it back with adding tactile pieces into our existing natural history dioramas. So we continually see this idea of it benefiting people with and without disabilities when we apply universal design. another important part of this is that in my studies of other organizations, I found that when people attend this notion to a particular practice, when they think of a practice as being better for everyone, they're more likely to sustain it over time. So that's just a brief summary of the way that we're thinking about inclusion at the Museum of Science, and more importantly, how we're thinking about making ourselves continually more inclusive over time. With that, I'll hand it back over to Greg.
Thanks very much, Christine. And in the interest of time, I want to first acknowledge that I know that we're going to be over a few minutes, our scheduled time, and I thank you all for your patience and hope that you will stick around with us for the last section of our program. And for those of you who are convened in groups, we'll try not to eat into too much of your on-site face-to-face discussion time. And now it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague Francesca Rosenberg from the Museum of Modern Art. And Francesca, I appreciate you being here to do a very quick introduction of the accessibility training program that you have at MoMA.
Yes. Hi, Greg. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with all of you this afternoon, and I will try and be as brief as possible. As Greg said, I was asked to speak about MoMA's disability equality training, and my team and I have been offering regular trainings for years, working with the frontline staff, but also back-of-house departments like curatorial and exhibition design. MoMA takes a holistic approach, as many of the panelists have touched on today, and we believe that accessibility is part of everyone's job. So we thought it was a good time to assess the impact of these trainings and to hear from staff about their perspective and experiences with accessibility. The questionnaire that we sent out, was created to help inform the development of an accessibility training video and to also help inform some general decision making about accessibility training at MoMA. We also had the support of the Accessibility Task Force, which is a group made up of representatives from almost all departments at MoMA. And from across the institution, the task force comes together twice a year in the full group and more often in the smaller groups to address access issues. So at the end of February of 2014, we shared a questionnaire with all MoMA staff and volunteers. And again, I won't go into all the questions, but generally a few that I'll mention. We asked what comes to mind when you think about accessibility and the visitor experience at MoMA. We asked, what do you think are the top 3 accessibility issues that need attention at MoMA? And we asked, what are 3 questions you have concerning accessibility and visitor experience? And we got a really great response. And some of the highlights, the feedback from the questionnaire, the majority of staff who completed this survey thought about disabilities in the physical sense, often referencing visitors with limited mobility who request or use wheelchairs. This narrow idea of disability is something which ran through the responses throughout the survey. There were also a significant amount of negative connotations and a negative perspective of disabilities apparent in some of the responses. Many respondents had a tendency to focus on all the differences between themselves and visitors with disabilities. And there was also a great deal of use of outdated language, such as handicap or special, and outdated stereotypes. So many felt that they would like and benefit from even more training. And what became apparent was that there was genuine desire and commitment to better serve people with disabilities, and that an attitudinal shift was key to this. So we felt the best way to bring this about would be for staff to hear directly from people with disabilities about their desire for equal participation. But logistically, it's very hard for us to schedule in-person trainings for 900 plus staff, and to do so by bringing numerous outside advisors with different disabilities. It would really be a scheduling nightmare. So we came up with what we thought could be the next best solution, and that was to create a video that includes the voice of people with disabilities. So we interviewed 7 people with different ages and backgrounds and disabilities, and asked all of them all sorts of questions. Why they visit museums, what they want at a museum, what their challenges and abilities are, and so on. The video also includes MoMA senior staff talking about access, and I think that that really shows that access is a priority at the institution.
Well, Francesca, let's go ahead and play this video.
Okay.
And then afterwards, we'll have just a couple of moments for you to weigh in and our other colleagues to engage in conversation. Adam, thanks a lot.
I think it's essential that the Museum of Modern Art be a leader in responding to communities with disabilities for a very simple reason. We believe in the power of art. We believe in the significance of the artists that we represent, and we believe in the importance of the audience that visits our museum. And when you put all of that together, you want the greatest possible number of people to enjoy the power of the art that's on display here, and that means addressing the needs of everybody who comes to the museum.
When somebody says, oh yeah, if you go up to the second floor and look at such and such, we have sculptures that you can touch if you use these gloves.
And how good it is to see. Imagine how it is to see it in a museum. Wow. You can actually see the brushstrokes and everything. This is so pretty.
Over the years, and especially in the last couple of decades, we've really tried to think of the institution as all-embracing.
I'm hard of hearing. Does the audio guide have a transcript?
It does. Let me show you how it works.
I'm very happy in museum environments. I love to see the things that people can do, the old paintings, the new work.
Between making it a priority within the institution, incorporating some of the latest technology, these are just the beginnings of what we would like to see at the museum.
Hi, how are you? Do you happen to have a large print brochure? Yes, we do. Oh, thank you very much. I tend to remember what was described to me in a painting, but I will never forget how a Monet was described to me or a Kandinsky was described. It's just, I remember art.
My grandfather taught me a whole lot of artists. Bosch, Monet, Mona Lisa. I love museums.
People come for a variety of reasons. Part of it could be very much community, meeting like-minded people.
I think that it's really important for us to be part of the community and to be part of the cultural life, and that really makes the art important to me.
This was the first place I came to for a touch tour.
I think the most important thing about the Museum of Modern Art is the way in which it can bring art and people together. And so the visitor experience is the essential aspect of what we think about when we think about how people will enjoy this museum. And of course, accessibility is essential to the visitor experience. It's at the heart of what we do here at the museum.
The world is supposed to be an equal place, so why not make it equal for us too, so that we can stop dreaming and live it.
Great. Thank you very much, Francesca. Thank you for sharing that. I want to turn the last few minutes of our time together to our colleagues. Francesca, I know you already had a chance to set up some of this information, but also welcome our colleague Ed Van Gemert, Vice Provost for Libraries at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ed, thanks for being here, and I really love your perspective on some of what you've heard today from all of our presenters and case studies.
Oh, Greg, thanks. I was really pleased to sit on the webinar, and I want to thank you and the Alliance for inviting libraries to participate. I want to extend an offer to you as well to participate with the Association of Research Libraries in subsequent programs. So that's one thing. I'm struck by the commonality of the themes between museums and libraries. The Association of Research Libraries represents the top 125 research universities and libraries across North America, as Katya had said, in Canada and the U.S. So we're obviously located in the same or many of the cities in which the museums represented here are located. And I think that there's just a natural alliance and collaboration. I won't take a lot of time, but from every single theme that we touched on today, I can't tell you how many times the word inclusive or inclusivity has been used by the presenters, but from the issues of education to best practices to public policy, to technology, the issues of mobility, issues of content and spaces. You know, our customers, whether they have issues of disabilities or not, expect the same content in the same time period at the same cost. They're not asking for anything different than other individuals that use our facilities. So, in summary, I think that both of our organizations are working toward moving away from basic or fundamental compliance to environments that are supportive of diversity and inclusion, and it's a really healthy environment to be working in and visiting. So, again, I thank you for including the libraries, and we look for other opportunities to collaborate.
Great, thanks, Ed. And it's been a real treat to bring together colleagues from other sectors as part of this program, and we're looking forward to more collaboration. And Sherry, this is just a couple of closing comments with you. Based on a little bit of what Ed said, it's a reminder to me that even within our own field, the museum field, we have so many different kinds of institutions, different types and sizes. And so in some ways, it's sort of like the disability rights community in the earlier days. We're not always a unified field, but we strive to be. Do you, in the work you do at the Intrepid and also in the work you do for the Museum Access Consortium, do you see any real differences in issues of access and inclusion across different types of institutions?
Well, Greg, that's a great question, and I'll say something that really has come to mind that I think will answer that to some degree. Is that listening to everything and looking at the chats and the comments that everyone has been posting, there's just a common element of the human experience that we're looking at, and there's the opportunity to be inclusive and not to be thinking as accessibility as the end game, but inclusion as the end game, and access and all the different programs and structures and opportunities there are to make it along the way. I think the case studies highlighted some great practices that are transferable to institutions, no matter what your content is. And I think that's what's really important. And this, just seeing all the people here, we have a great support structure as well across disciplines, across institutions, and I think that we need to build more on that. I know there was mention of a lot of different consortiums that are all around the country with resources and opportunities, so I really encourage getting involved, reaching out to each other. That's what this is about, sharing practice, sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, and experiences, including those lessons learned. And so I think that's just a great opportunity for kind of a launching point of taking a lot of what we've just heard and seeing how you can then put that into practice to everybody. what you might want to talk more about with your colleagues, near and far.
Great. Thanks so much, Sherry. And I want to give a quick closing thank you to our colleagues, our special guests, Francesca and Ed, certainly our case studies, Rebecca, Katya, and Christine, and our lead presenters, Betty, Beth, and Valerie. Really appreciate you being here, part of this program. I also want to acknowledge that at the tail end of your handout and in a separate PDF, we've put together some discussion questions that you can use in your groups or later on with your staff if you would like. And we work on building these questions around the three broad themes or the three broad goals of this program: building awareness, help fostering action in your institution, in your community, and fostering advocacy across our institutions and our respective fields. With that said, I'm very pleased to be here, a part of this program, to acknowledge the support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Coalition to Advance Learning in Archives, Libraries, and Museums, and our colleagues at OCLC and MAC, and really everyone who's had such an important role in this program. I do thank you for your patience in letting us go a little bit over time today. For those of you who are registered attendees, you will be getting a follow-up email from AAM with the recording link. I should also mention that we will be making the handout available in a PDF, and also the chat transcript and the closed captioning transcripts available to you, since we know that a lot of great information has been shared. I hope that you will join us for our next program in this series, which will be next Wednesday, in which we will look at how cultural institutions are responding to visitors with vision or hearing issues. And the third part of this program on October 28th, looking at cognitive, emotional, or cognitive or emotional disabilities. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Greg.